in that area. Okay, turn on? Yeah, there it goes. Okay, let's see if it's in the right direction. Yeah, it's close enough, I guess. Okay. Anyway, as ugly as that may seem, now they've done studies looking at this. In the 1920s, the Nazi Party gained power throughout Germany based in part, on the platform of blaming all Germany's problems on the Jewish population. The Jews were the ones that surrendered. They could have won World War I. They were winning World War I, and the Jews capitulated. So it was the Jewish people's fault that Germany had lost World War I, as ridiculous as that sounds. They blamed them, and of course Hitler was part of this whole thing. The reality was that the Jewish population in Germany were part of the German army, and they fought in World War I just like everybody else did. It's not like the Jewish population didn't fight. They won as many medals as anyone else. Some of the German generals during World War I were Jewish. Research by Voigtlander and Voth in 2012 disclosed that German cities that had Jewish pogroms in the 14th century were the same cities that had higher rates of violence against the Jews in the 1920s and had higher support for the Nazi Party. So they had a political, their political leanings were anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, as odd as that may seem. So a lot of times populations will look for scapegoats. 9/11 happened in the United States, and George W. Bush put a coalition together to fight against Al-Qaeda. There were some countries wouldn't join. They wouldn't join. They thought it was silly. He was attacking their own people, especially when he invaded Iraq. It just didn't make any sense. Who destroyed, what 9/11 occurred, they were terrorists, of course. Where were these terrorists from? Were they from Iraq? Were they from Afghanistan? Where were they from? The guys that flew the airplanes into the World Trade Center. This is important. I mean, these are the bad guys. So where were these bad guys from? I mean, we invaded two countries because of this. Were they from Iraq? Were they from Afghanistan? Where were they from?
Pakistan.
I'm sorry?
Afghanistan.
They weren't from Afghanistan. None of them were from Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda was in Afghanistan. And that's why we invaded Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda. That's where they were headquartered. The Taliban were controlling Afghanistan, and the Taliban allowed Al-Qaeda to be there. And that's the reason we invaded Afghanistan. Why did we invade Iraq? Oh, well, first of all, who were the guys that were the terrorists? Where were they from? There were 14 of them. Where were they from? No idea, huh? Wow. These are the bad guys. You should know where the bad guys come from. Otherwise, we don't know who to shoot at, right? Bad guys. They were from, 12 of them were from the same country. So maybe we should have invaded that country. Does that make sense? We didn't. I know, we didn't invade that country. Any idea where it was? 12 of them came from Saudi Arabia. 12 of the 14 terrorists came from Saudi Arabia. Now, if you know anything about Saudi Arabia, they're our allies in the Middle East, along with Israel, that's about it. So we can't invade our country that we're allied with, can we? Not only that, but Osama bin Laden, where's Osama bin Laden from? He's the bad guy. He's the one that orchestrated this whole thing. Shouldn't we attack his country? Osama bin Laden's country? He's the bad guy. Shouldn't we invade his country? Where was he from? The bin Laden family is one of the richest families in the country of Saudi Arabia. but we didn't, well, they're one of our allies, so we can't attack them. The other two individuals were from Jordan. But of course, they're our allies. Well, at least they're not our enemies in the Middle East. So why did we invade Iraq? And this is where we got into trouble. This is where we lost a lot of allies, when we invaded Iraq.
With the oil
Assumption.
Well, that was the first time we invaded Iraq. That was H.W. Bush that invaded Iraq to free Kuwait. That was the first time. The second time we invaded Iraq, why did we do it? We were afraid of weapons of mass destruction being amassed by Saddam Hussein, but that we didn't have any proof. We really didn't have any proof. We had pictures of buildings. And we said, oh, that's a chemical plant where it's making biological weapons, which wasn't true at all. As it turned out, it wasn't true at all. So why did we invade Iraq? That's a good question. It had to do with the weapons of mass destruction. So who became the scapegoat for what's been going on? I mean, we've been fighting over there. It's the longest war we've ever fought in Iraq. And here, they didn't really do anything, did they? They didn't have anything to do with 9/11. But it was right on the heels of 9/11 that we invaded Iraq. And we wanted the Brits to come in with us, we wanted the Germans to come in with us, we wanted the French to come in with us, and the French refused completely. And because of that, we got mad at the French. And if you remember in like 2003, 2004, the French aren't joining us in our battle against the evil Iraqis. So what did we do to the French? How did we change things in the United States? They changed the name of French fries in Congress, remember? They didn't call them French fries anymore. They called them freedom fries. I know, isn't it? That's great. We stopped eating French dressing. If you ordered French dressing, you could get in a fist fight. And that almost happened to me up in Montana. They were pissed at the French because they wouldn't join us in this war that the French couldn't understand. And now looking back, we can't understand why we invaded Iraq. The excuse we gave was that it had to do with weapons of mass destruction.
What's that saying? What's that translation to Viva la France?
Long live France.
The house says.
Yeah.
Because I think it was after the trip to Europe. I remember we were in an excursion group, and we hit somewhere in the middle, and you can hear some of the groups just yelling out, passing by. They knew we were Americans because Americans, when they walk, they take the whole space up. The way they walk. Yeah. They take the whole, like they're walking like John Wayne. Yeah. They take up like 2 sidewalks and they walk. Right. These other groups, they stay together. Right. You can just tell how Americans were walking, and they were just walking, and you can just they were saying, I think they were protesting. Yeah.
Sure. Because we were pissed at it. I mean, we were upset that they wouldn't join our battle. They were our allies. They should, even if we make stupid mistakes, they should make the same stupid mistake. But they refused to do it. So we scapegoated them. We said one of the reasons that it took so long in Iraq was because to normalize Iraq, which we haven't done yet, but one of the reasons is because our allies wouldn't come with us. So we had countries like Montenegro fighting with us. These odd little countries. And of course, we scapegoated the poor French. We changed the name of French fries to freedom fries. Well, it's worse than that. I mean, French fries aren't really French fries. They're made in Germany. I mean, they were invented in Germany. It's a German food, and they don't even call them French fries. They call them pommes frites, which means fried potatoes. Pommes frites. Anyway, okay. Scapegoats. Evolving cultures, because cultures evolve from the past circumstances, the early conditions of a culture matter a great deal with respect to how cultures subsequently evolve. The critical role of early conditions is one important reason that cultural differences can persist across time. And of course, if we're talking about India, We're talking about different sections of India, and they evolved differently. A good example of that would be in Mississippi. Mississippi was settled in 3 different waves. The first wave came along the Gulf Coast. It was the first area that was settled. We're talking about Mississippi, state of Mississippi. So the Gulf Coast was the first place that was settled. If you go to the Gulf Coast, the people on the Gulf Coast are completely different than the people that, than the other people in Mississippi. The second area that was settled was the Delta, what they call the Mississippi Delta. Well, the Delta doesn't really go that far up to Memphis. That's silly. That's right like in the middle of the country. But it has to do with the Mississippi River. So the first people that settled Mississippi were along the Gulf Coast. The second portion of Mississippi that was settled was along the Mississippi River. And the last section that was settled in Mississippi was East Mississippi. They had to come in from Alabama. They had to walk all the way across to get there. So the Gulf Coast was settled first, the Delta was settled second, and the last group of people that came in were the people in East Mississippi. So if you, and I used to teach at a college called East Mississippi Community College. It wasn't Eastern Mississippi Community College. It was East Mississippi Community College. The people on the Gulf Coast, of course, were relatively wealthy. They didn't really build plantations, but it was very similar to New Orleans. So they had commerce all along the coast. The people that came into the Delta, those were plantation owners, and they bought lots of slaves, and they lost lots of slaves because it's not a very healthy area. So what the people did who settled the Mississippi Delta, they had plantations, but they didn't live on the plantations. They lived inland. They lived far away from all the malaria and all the other horrors of living along the Mississippi River. And then the people that came in in East Mississippi were all poor farmers, and they built all these small farms. So if you look at the people of Mississippi, you've got 3 different chunks and 3 completely different cultures. And it has to do with how the place was settled, and when it was settled, and who did it. So initially, of course, the people that came in were fairly wealthy, and they were commercial fishermen. They had commerce. They built Biloxi is part of Mississippi, and then the Delta. If you look at the Delta, the cities that developed along the Delta are very relatively small cities. Nothing really developed until you get all the way up to Memphis. So if you wander down the Mississippi River along Mississippi, there's no big cities along that area. And then, of course, in East Mississippi, you have a totally different situation. And so the capital is in Jackson, and Jackson is like right in between all 3 of those different places, which most people don't realize. You know, it's over here. Now, why in the world would you put your capital over here? And the answer is because that's where all 3 of them intersected, all 3 of these different groups. So the people that settled East Mississippi were mostly poor farmers, relatively poor farmers. So that's what we're talking about here. It all depends on how people evolved, how things evolved. So when so when the Civil War started, the plantation owners along the Delta, of course, they had lots and lots of slaves. They were very much in favor of the Confederacy. And the guys along the coast, most of the guys along the coast, they were businessmen, so they didn't really care about the South. And the people in the East, oddly enough, the people in the East, these were small farmers. They didn't have any slaves anyway. So these individuals were against the Confederacy. And they actually, most of them were still loyal to the Union. So when the Union forces came in, they were able to take Biloxi without very much trouble, because most of the people in Biloxi were not Confederates. And then when they invaded and they came down through Shiloh, through Corinth up in the corner of Mississippi, they had a lot of allies there. And so it's not like they were being bushwhacked all the time by Confederates. It was really kind of an odd thing. It's one of those stories that most people don't know, because they don't tell those kinds of stories The only stories they tell is how loyal, So what do we know about the Civil War? Well, Gone with the Wind is about the only information that we had. But the reality is there were a lot of people that were very loyal to the North in the South. They didn't really join the North. As a matter of fact, there was a movie about a guy that rebelled against the Confederacy. I can't remember. It had Matthew McConaughey as the guy with the beard. He married a black woman, but he created his own chunk of his own independent state. I can't think of what that movie is. Anyway, it just came out a couple of years ago. It was really kind of fascinating.
Something Jones?
The State of Jones?
State of Jones, I think.
Yeah, something like that. Anyway, that's real.
State of Jones.
I'm sorry?
Free State of Jones.
Free State of Jones, that's what it was, yeah. And there were a lot of people that were not loyal to the South, and they joined him in the swamps of Mississippi. And that's in eastern Mississippi, that portion where I used to live in Columbus. Okay, talking about how cultures evolve, we can talk about the people of Boston. The people of Boston was settled by Protestant Puritans. The Puritans were kind of interesting people. And we think of Protestants and they're all the same. Methodists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, they're all the same, right? Well, the reality is they're not all the same. We're going to talk about two different groups of Protestants that settled in the the Americas, and they were completely different. The Puritans were kind of autocratic. They had a hierarchy. They believed in social control. They were a very controlling religion. So if you wore the wrong shirt, the elders came and talked to you, and they shook their finger at you and told you, don't do it again, don't wear that damn shirt. You've got too much, your belt buckles are too big, they're showy, you can't do that. So they tried to control people, and the Puritans were those kinds of people, to the extent that if you were different, they would kick you out of their colony. And that's one of the reasons why Massachusetts became one colony and Rhode Island became another colony, because there were people that acted differently. So what did they do with them? They kicked them out of the colony. They wouldn't let them stay. And that's where Roger Williams established Rhode Island. Another group of individuals that they hated were the Quakers, because the Quakers were individualists. These guys were more collectivists. They wanted social control. They sought social control. So those are the individuals that settled in Boston. The Puritans emphasized respect for authority. Yeah, right. And the importance of applying wealth and social position to community goals. So their idea was accumulation of wealth. And they felt that if God really favored them, that they would become very, very wealthy. That was a sign that God loved you. Because you had so much money. So they tried to accumulate as much wealth as possible. They tried to show as much wealth as possible within the social strictures of the church. So you rode to church in a carriage rather than walking to church, and that showed your wealth. This is how God is telling you that you are better than other people. God would show you that you were better by giving you all the money in the world. Now you think, wait a minute, do Protestants really believe that? And the answer is yeah, and this is one of the reasons why you have all these wealthy people along the East Coast, and they do things like buy yachts, and they become president of the United States, and they build casinos, and they do all this stuff to show how wealthy they are, to show how much God loves them. As odd as that sounds, but this is a point of fact. Many of the original Puritans were highly educated intellectuals, and they felt that their dream of forming a utopian society would emerge only from an educated population. So they believed in education. So there were two ways that you could show that God loved you. One was to accumulate wealth, and the other was to accumulate a lot of education. So they supported education. They supported higher education. The Quakers, on the other hand, settled in Philadelphia. The Quakers were completely different. They were also a Protestant group, but they were more individualistic. My people were Quakers. They settled in New Jersey. My people settled in Salem, New Jersey. as odd as that may seem. And they, when they, when they settled there, they had to promise that they were going to pay back somebody owned it. It was like the Duke of Marlborough owned this land. And so they said, well, we'll settle there and we will pay you 200 bars of gold every year. You know, one of those kinds of things. Their idea was that they would mine gold while they were in New Jersey. Well, there's no gold in New Jersey. So they came to arrears, of course. They couldn't pay the amount of money that they owed the Duke of Marlborough. So he sent over a sheriff. The leader of the group was named Bradway, as it turns out. I know. The leader of the group was named Bradway. So they sent a sheriff over, and his name was Bradway. So there's two families of Bradways in Salem, New Jersey, and one of them was a cop, and the other guy, one guy was supposed to arrest the other guy, and they have the same name. That's interesting. That's not that interesting. Anyway, they were Quakers, and Quakers were very individualistic. Quakerism emphasizes pragmatic concerns, individual equality, and tolerance. They believe in equality. Everybody's the same. So they didn't believe in showy wealth. They didn't think that you needed to do that. So whereas the Puritans, they were looking for money and they were looking for education, the Quakers, they believed in individualism. They didn't believe in showing who you were. They didn't think that that was the right thing to do. The Quakers built the University of Pennsylvania with a utilitarian curriculum with medical, business, and engineering schools dominating the university. The school received little community support. Of course, the Puritans, if they started a university, it would the more money you gave to it, the more God loved you, because not only were you supporting education, but you were also showing your wealth. So there were a lot of people that gave a lot of money to Harvard University. Harvard University was started by the Puritans. University of Pennsylvania, which is also an Ivy League school, was started by the Quakers. But the difference between University of Pennsylvania and Harvard is like night and day. And the reason is because the Quakers don't give money away. They just don't give money away. They think it's too showy, so they just kind of keep it in their pockets. They don't wear large belt buckles to show off how rich they are. They don't go to church in a carriage, because that would show how wealthy they are. They don't do these things. They only do pragmatic things. So when they started a college, they put together a medical school, a business school, and an engineering school. Very pragmatic things to do. When they put Harvard together, instead of having all these pragmatic areas to study, the Puritans decided that they would emphasize community service and liberal arts. So you can study anything at Harvard. At University of Pennsylvania, you study only what is there, only the pragmatic disciplines that they support. The Harvard University received tremendous community and financial support, and today it is the most heavily endowed private institution in the United States. Mainly because of the fact that it's in Boston. And the people in Boston are Puritan, or were Puritans. Or Puritans don't really exist anymore. They're Congregationalists now. They call themselves Congregationalists. But it's still heavily endowed. If you are a graduate of Harvard and you have $6 million, you give $2 million to Harvard. That's just the way it works. A lot of very, very wealthy people go to Harvard, and then they give an endowment to the school. One of the ways that you can get your kid into Harvard is to give Harvard lots of money. If you give them $20 million, then your grandchildren can go to Harvard. It's called an endowment. And because of your endowment, of course, your grandkids get in automatically. It's called a legacy. And this is how, okay, so the Bush family is actually from Connecticut. The Bushes are from Connecticut. They're not from Texas, even though George W. sounds like he just tripped off of a ranch in southwest Texas or something. He was raised in Texas. He raised those kids in Texas, but his family actually comes from Connecticut. George H.W. Bush is from Connecticut. So how in the world did George W. Bush get into get into Yale, geez, his grades were like C's and D's. How in the world did he ever get into Yale? Well, George H.W. Bush gave Yale a lot of money. So W was able to get into Yale University. So if we look at the two institutions, the number of political leaders coming out of Harvard is huge, is massive, because that's one of the things they study. Do the Puritan or do the Quakers study politics? No, it's not pragmatic enough. They don't study that. They only study practical things. So the University of Pennsylvania, for one thing, doesn't have very much of an endowment, and for the other thing, we don't see a lot of political leaders coming out of the University of Pennsylvania. We see political leaders coming out of Harvard, we see political leaders coming out of Yale, we see them coming out of Brown University, but hardly anybody coming out of the University of Pennsylvania. Mainly because these guys, it is a Quaker institution, and Quakers are very pragmatic people. So we can look at Boston, and we can compare Boston, and we can compare Philadelphia. The people from Boston and the people from Philadelphia. And what we see is a lot more political leaders are coming out of Boston than are coming out of Philadelphia. The Quakers do not do that. They're not that kind of people. They're also pacifists, so they don't fight in wars. So they don't become generals. It's not something that they allow themselves to do. Now, if you know me at all, you know that I was in the military for 12 years. I've got a picture in my office of my brothers and I and my dad, and we were all in the military at the same time. So we've got this Quaker ancestry, so how in the world did we ever become soldiers? What happened? What happened was a civil war. During the Civil War, some people left the religion because they were pacifists, and they believed this is too important a war. This is too important a situation in our country. We need to fight to free the slaves. So the Quakers were abolitionists. So that's the reason that my family stopped practicing Quakerism, or it's the Church of the Friends. That's the reason we quit the church, is because we felt like we needed to go to war to free the slaves, to free the African Americans. Boston's culture has maintained its elitism, the Boston Brahmins, and respect for authority that can be traced back to its Puritan roots. So if we look at Boston, then there's a lot of things we can talk about with Boston, and we'll talk about them in a minute. But these two pictures are very real. The Boston people think that they're better than other people. Remember, they show their wealth. We see a lot of parties in Boston, very wealthy parties in Boston. We see wealthy parties in Boston. But Philadelphia, not the same. It's not quite the same situation. The electricity's gone off, so I'm afraid that you have lost your PowerPoint until it comes back on. So that's Boston. Philadelphia, on the other hand, and there's a reason why I showed you a picture of Will Smith. He is from Philadelphia. Remember, they believe in equality. They believe everybody is equal. So in Boston, you have some very segregated areas in Boston. Black people live here. Portuguese people live there. It's a very segregated area. But in Philadelphia, a completely different situation. Everybody lives together. There's more equality in Philadelphia. But then again, of course, so when we talk about, so we can talk about when baseball teams segregated or integrated. When did they integrate? Well, the first black baseball player was in 1947. Jackie Robinson joined, I think. He joined the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. So slowly the Major League Baseball integrated, and different teams in different areas integrated at different times. Cleveland was the next ball team to integrate. The Giants in New York City integrated in 1951. Who else integrated? Boston Braves had to move out of Boston in order to integrate. They moved to Milwaukee, and they integrated almost immediately. I know. So that's the only reason Hank Aaron was able to play for them, is because when they moved from Boston to Milwaukee, Milwaukee's is a Midwest town for one thing, and it's more liberal. And so he could play for them. When did the Boston Red Sox integrate? Any idea?
No.
Boston Red Sox were the last team in the major leagues to integrate. They were the last team in the major leagues to integrate. Now that seems a little odd, doesn't it? Here, this is a city in the north. It's not like it's Atlanta, Georgia. It's not like it's Birmingham, Alabama. This is Boston, Massachusetts, but it was the last team to integrate. During the 1970s, when they were integrating the schools in the South, they also had to integrate some schools in the North. And one of the cities that had to integrate was Boston. It was the last city in the North to integrate. As odd as that seems. So here we have the Puritans, who have an idea of wealth and showiness. They also have a concept of social control, and so Boston had racial problems into the 1980s, whereas places like Philadelphia had always been integrated. I come from an industrial town in the Midwest, and Muncie, where I used to live, Muncie, Indiana, has always been integrated. My dad went to school with African American kids, and he's from Logansport, Indiana. And here's Boston, and it's still segregated into the 1980s. What's going on here? Well, what's going on here is this concept of social control. Because it believed in social control, Boston had a real serious problem with integration. And so they stayed segregated for an extended length of time. They had riots in Boston because of busing. They didn't want to bus. So here we've got two different cities. They're not that far apart, maybe 100 miles apart, and one's like night and the other's like day. Philadelphia, we don't have as many leaders coming out of Philadelphia, but at the same time we have integration that started back in the 18th century. He said, okay, wait a minute, I'll make this thing work. Whoops, there we go. As people immigrated to Boston and Philadelphia, they tended to adjust themselves to the prevailing cultural traditions as established by the Puritans and the Quakers, respectively. So when people moved there, they changed the way that they thought. So if you moved to Boston, you accepted the way people think in Boston. Remember, there's a lot of social control in Boston. If you moved to Philadelphia, you accepted the way people thought in Philadelphia, which was a more integrated, more accepting, more individualistic concept. So if you moved to Boston, you were kind of a stuck-up person, and if you moved to Philadelphia, you were more of an accepting person. So the people that moved to Philadelphia, despite what they were thinking wherever they were before, they changed to think the way that people did in Philadelphia. Does that make sense? Can we use that here on the reservation? If somebody moves onto the reservation, do they start acting like a Navajo? They don't? What do they start acting like? Don't I? I'm not acting like If somebody comes from another reservation when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Isn't that the way it works here? So do they try to change everything? Is that what happens when somebody comes down from Cheyenne country? No? When the Crow come down here from, like any of you guys have married a Crow. I'm kidding. The Crows are all right. They're tall. They're really tall. Tall and skinny. Slender, I'm sorry. Did I say skinny? I meant slender. Okay. Okay, so the two cities are completely different. And I tried to use people coming onto the reservation as an example, but I guess. So even the white guys, some of them don't they grow long hair and put it in a ponytail? A greasy gray ponytail? Haven't I seen those guys around here? What's wrong with white people? Why is their hair so greasy and why is it always gray? Hence, the cities have been able to maintain their cultural traditions of their forebears, and even to this day, of course. Now, Boston. Why are there so many people on the reservation who are not Jacoby Ellsbury? Why are they Boston Red Sox fans? Is it because of Jacoby Ellsbury? He's a baseball player that used to play for Boston. Who's he play for now? Plays for the Yankees. He sold out to the Yankees. Okay. We'll see what happens next. Often we try to figure out what others are thinking when all we have to go on is what the people are telling us or our observations of how they behave. So how do we know what they're thinking? What's going on in their mind? A lot of times we get it wrong. If you're driving around in Gallup and you look at somebody walking along the street, what are they thinking? Do you have a clue as to what they're thinking? If somebody comes up to me, am I going to assume that they want to panhandle? That they're after some money? Well, if I'm in Gallup, that's probably what's going on. If I'm in Albuquerque, I can assure you that's what's going on. I stopped at a gas station in Albuquerque, and I had 2 people ask me for gas money. I know, they were sitting right behind me in their car, and they asked me for gas money. I don't have any cash, and I found out that my credit card doesn't work. Do you have a couple dollars that I could, I've got a 3-year-old in the back of my car. Really? It happened to me twice. One was on the other aisle. They saw that the guy didn't get any money, so he came over and tried to get some money from me. I thought, that's weird. Now, the weird part was that they parked at in front of a pump, and they just stayed there. They didn't move. And I was thinking, geez, they're blocking people from getting gasoline. The people in the gas station must be pissed that they're not moving. Anyway, that happened in Albuquerque. A good example of pluralistic, this is known as pluralistic ignorance, when you think that everybody is thinking the same thing. That may have been what happened in the last election. A lot of pluralistic ignorance was taking place. Everybody was assuming that people were thinking one thing, and in reality, they were all thinking something totally different. So we do misinterpret other people's behavior. We misinterpret what they're thinking, or why they're thinking what they're thinking. So the question is, now, how are those people that voted for Trump, how are they feeling right now? I mean, how many people have been indicted out of his administration? 5? 5 are in jail now? I think. I know, he's going to break the record. The record's held by Richard Nixon.
How much was that?
I'm sorry?
How much was that?
2 dozen. 2 dozen, yeah, 2 dozen. Most of it had to do with the Watergate. Yeah, okay. So when we talk about pluralistic ignorance, a good example would be what was divulged in studies done after World War II, looking at the German people. The question was, are these people evil? We can look at the Japanese. They bombed Pearl Harbor. It was a sneak attack. Are these evil people? So we did studies looking at how the Japanese felt about World War II and how the Germans felt about World War II. The Germans had a lot more to answer for than the Japanese did. The Japanese did some pretty horrendous things to the Chinese mostly, not to us, but to the Chinese. The Japanese didn't believe in prisoners. If you surrendered, the Japanese thought you were dishonored, and therefore you didn't deserve to be treated like a prisoner of war. So they treated you very badly, and they beat you, and they killed you, and they did a lot of horrible, horrible things to the people that they captured. And this is one of the reasons, if you look at World War II, and you look at the statistics coming out of World War II, we weren't capturing any Japanese soldiers in our first battles with the Japanese, and they weren't capturing any of our men. It was either kill or be killed, and that was the way it worked. And we were just annihilating all of them. We weren't capturing anybody. And the reason we weren't capturing anybody was because they weren't capturing anybody. So if you surrendered to the Japanese, they killed you. And since we knew that, When the Japanese tried to surrender to us, which didn't happen very often, we killed them. So we took hardly any prisoners. So we're fighting battle after battle after battle, and everybody's dying. You know, the Germans, the Japanese have 30,000 troops on this island, and after the battle, 27,000 of them died. You're going, well, this doesn't happen in any other war. What's going on? And that's exactly what was going on. We didn't start capturing people until like 44. So here we're fighting battles against the Japanese in 42 and 43, and we're not capturing anybody. It was just horrible. And we had all these interpreters waiting to get information from the Japanese, and we weren't getting any information at all, because for one thing, the soldiers weren't capturing any Japanese. They were afraid if they tried to capture the Japanese, that they would explode a hand grenade and kill everybody. So we weren't capturing anybody. It was just a mess. So the Germans, of course, they not only did we fight against these guys, but also they tried to annihilate whole populations of people. They tried to exterminate all the Jews. They tried to exterminate all the gypsies. They tried to exterminate all the evangelicals, all the evangelists that came in, all the born-again Christians. So they tried to exterminate whole populations of individuals. So we were thinking, these must be the most demon-like, god-awful people in the whole wide world. So they did studies, and what they discovered was that wasn't true at all. It wasn't true that the Germans were evil. There were some evil Germans, certainly. But what it turned out to be was, and they did these studies, they did this research, and what they discovered was that they weren't evil, they were thoughtless and conforming. So they just did what everybody else did. As odd as that sounds. And that's pluralistic ignorance. We just assumed that they were bad because, I mean, they're trying to kill off all the Jews. They're trying to kill off all the gypsies. The reality is, well, we won't go into that. The reality is we should have gone in there earlier, but we didn't. Why? Because we didn't really care about the gypsies, and we certainly didn't care about the Jewish people, which is a tragedy, which is a real, real tragedy. We should have done something earlier than that. We should have gone into Europe in 1943 instead of 44. But instead, we attacked someplace else to relieve pressure on the Russians, as odd as that may seem. Okay, well, anyway, that's the end of chapter 3. Is this the fourth week or the third week? Is this the third week?
Third.
It's the third week. So that's the end of chapter 3. I'm ahead. I know. So tell all your friends, especially people, if you have friends that have taken my class before, any of my classes before, they know how far behind I usually get. It's a good thing that you can't see you can't see the PowerPoint, because there is nudity in this PowerPoint. And actually, it had to do with a point that I was trying to make. But now that you can't see it, it doesn't really matter that there's a naked lady. Actually, there's 3 naked ladies in the picture. So chapter 4 deals with methods for studying culture and psychology. So that's what we're going to talk about in chapter 4 is research. This is something that Dr. Ami is interested in. This is something that Dr. Wolf is interested in, and of course Dr. Kine is interested in this as well. I'm not as interested in this. I just find it really kind of fascinating the way all this stuff kind of fits together. So I'm going to talk about it from a cultural point of view. How in the world do you study other cultures? You have to be really, really careful. The first thing that you have to do when you're studying another culture is find out about that culture. You need to understand who these people are, and you need to understand so that you don't make a stupid mistake. Like coming down here and talking about dead people. One of the things that Dr. Wolf was interviewing, Dr. Wolf was interviewing for this job, and she said, well, what I'd like to do, I can get my hands on brains. I can get a human brain, and I can bring it so that everybody could see it. And I'm thinking, and of course we told her at that point, no, don't have them handle a human brain. My God, you can't do that. But she didn't understand. Well, she kind of did, but she didn't understand the taboos that were here. So you need to understand this stuff. I mean, otherwise you're going to be making some really unfortunate mistakes that will injure your research. So what should always be the initial step in studying people from other cultures is to learn something about the culture that you're studying. You need to understand the culture. You need to at least think about the culture. Actually, it's an insult to people if you don't try to find out about their culture. It's an insult to those people. You're like saying it's not important. Your culture's not important to me. I'm just assuming that you're just like me. And that, that's not a bad point of view, but it is certainly not a realistic point of view. Your culture should be as important to me as your culture is to you. A little bit of knowledge can go a long way in avoiding costly and embarrassing mistakes. One example of that, in 1997, Schwader and his colleagues were researching family meals. So they were looking at people and how they sat down at a family meal. So they decided that they were going to find information about rural India. What kind of family meals do they have in rural India is the question. Does anybody know what kind of family meals they eat in rural India? Nobody? Why would you know? How do you eat in rural India?
With your hands.
Well, they do eat with their hands, but okay. So the question was, what kind of family meals do they eat in rural India? So they called ahead and they asked somebody from the area if they could come in and they could research family meals. And since they don't eat family meals in rural India, this guy decided, well, that's what they're looking for. So he got a family to put up a table and to sit down at a table just like an English family or whatever. And so he got them to eat a family meal, which is not something that is done in rural India. But he got them to do it because he thought that's what they wanted. So that's what they saw. They saw a family eating a meal in rural India. So they put it in their research. All over the world, people eat family meals. In rural India, in Africa, in the United States, in Europe. And it was completely erroneous. It was completely wrong. So that's one of the problems that you can have from doing your research. Sometimes you get the wrong piece of information. And of course, they happily recorded their discovery and they mistakenly included it in their research. And then they looked like idiots when somebody pointed out to them, those guys don't really eat family meals. I don't know what the hell you're talking about. And of course, they have two really neat pictures. One of the pictures is a family from India sitting down to a meal. But this is in Mumbai, which used to be Bombay. And then the way they really eat meals in rural India. The males eat and the females eat, but they eat separately. They don't eat together. And you're right, they do eat with their fingers. Anyway. One can learn about another culture in a variety of ways. The simplest way to read is to read existing texts and ethnographies about the culture. But if you guys read a text about the Navajo culture, how accurate would it be? And who wrote the damn thing? Well, if Wilson wrote it, it's probably fairly accurate. But what if, I don't know, Don Robinson wrote the damn thing? He's a Hindu, I don't know.
50%?
Yeah, I mean, how accurate is it? Up north, up on the Fort Belknap Reservation, a group of Catholic priests came to the school, or not the school, but the reservation, and they wrote a book about the Gros Ventre culture, the Gros Ventres. They're called the Yellow Books, and they published it at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. And of course, they talked to various people. And the question is, how accurate what were the stories that they heard? Now, these are Catholic priests, so they're not going to tell them anything that the priests would find offensive, right? So that's not there at all. None of that is there at all. But also, why would they tell them about their secrets? And this is a question Travis and I have pondered. I mean, if this is a secret ceremony, am I going to tell a Catholic priest about my secret ceremony? This is a problem with the Cheyenne culture. Yeah, some of this stuff you can't write down. Some of your ceremonies, I'm sure, no, you can't write down. So it's the same way with their culture. Now the problem was that they lost their culture. It kind of, with all the missionaries and all the Catholic priests and all the other weird people that came in and all the boarding schools, they shipped them off to California, they shipped them to Phoenix, they shipped them to South Dakota. They shipped them all over the place, and when they came back, they lost their culture, and the culture was just completely lost. The tribe was protected by 2 pipes and 2 bundles. One was a feather pipe, the other was a flat pipe. They have maintained the ceremonies for the flat pipe. So they know how to open the bundle that gives them, that protects the tribe. But for the feathered pipe, they've lost the whole process. So now they can't open the bundle. If they can't open the bundle, they can't protect the tribe. So all that makes sense? And they lost it because of the boarding schools. So the guy that knew it became too Catholic, and the Catholic priest kept telling them that it was sinful, it was heathen, he was being a heathen, and so they lost it. It's gone. Nobody has a clue how to open that bundle. So it just sits there, and they protect it, but they can't open it. And they can't, I mean, there's a degree of magic with this pipe, but they can't access that magic with the pipe. I know, it's kind of a tragedy. So this kind of stuff happens all over the place, as sad and as unfortunate as that is. So should we believe the priest that wrote the yellow books? Is all of this accurate? And of course, when I was there, I was asking that very question. And the people that were reading the yellow books, they wanted to use it for their research. They wanted to say, this is the way it used to be, and this is what we should be doing now, because now we're following the yellow book. But now the yellow books, of course, they were written by priests for one thing, and for another thing, the information may be incomplete, just like how to open the bundle. There was one family that protected the flat pipe. Now they can open the flat pipe because they protected not only the bundle, but also the ceremonies to open that pipe, as interesting as that is. So the question is are the yellow books accurate? And a lot of people want to accept the yellow books just like they accept the Bible as the Word of God. They want to accept the yellow books as the word of their ancestors, but is it really the word of their ancestors? See, this is a problem, isn't it? So you got to feel sorry for those guys up north. Maybe a little bit. Un poquito. However, learning about culture through books and ethnographies limits you to learning about the ideas that the author thought was relevant, and that's the other problem. Here we have this white guy. He's the one that's telling you what is important in this book. He's telling you how he feels about this. So if he writes a book, if somebody comes down here, some Jewish guy from New York City decides to do research on the Navajo reservation, and he comes down here and he writes an ethnography about the Navajo, and then you compare it to what Wilson has written and what Wilson has said, is it going to be exactly the same? No. For one thing.
There's one example, I think it was Margaret Mead.
Right.
One of the Pacific Islanders that she studied, and everything was incorrect of what she recorded.
Right.
And years later, they found it. They I don't know what they did with her research. I think they dumped it, or she explained it. It was just false.
It was her interpretation of what was going on. So that's one person looking at something and saying, this is the way it is. But if the two of us see the same thing, you're going to see one thing and I'm going to see something totally different. And if I were from that culture, I would see things completely different than you do, because everything that you do is tainted by your culture, right? Everything that I do is tainted by my culture. I don't have a choice. But if you're talking about white people in Indiana, you know, I'm from Indiana, so when you look at it, you look at it from your point of view, which is totally different, potentially totally different from my point of view. Is all this making sense? You know, this is scary, isn't it? So can we believe anything? Is Wilson the final word on anything Navajo?
Yes.
Just asking. Or is it Avery? Wait a minute, let's think about this for a minute. Do they always agree? Oh, this thing's back on. Actually, it should come on now, I think. Maybe? There we go. Okay. Sorry, it probably could have come on half an hour ago. Oh man, the electricity came on and I didn't understand what was going on. Okay. Another approach is to find a collaborator who is from the culture that you are studying and who is interested in pursuing, oh man, come on, get out of there. Who's interested in pursuing the same research with you. And of course, that's, if you really want to do research in an area, that's what you need to do. You need to find somebody who has knowledge. And of course, I had lots of friends when I was up north, and they would tell me things. They would tell me things, and it was kind of like a collaboration. But sometimes they told me, these are really jokers. These guys are real funny people. So sometimes they lie to you. So here I was. I'm working at the bingo hall, and I'm the what do they call it? The runner, the guy that sells extra bingo sheets. Okay, that was my job. So here I am, I'm running around, and somebody wins, and then they donate back to, I was working for the Veterans Powwow. So they donate part of their winnings back to the Veterans Powwow. So I didn't know everybody there. Eventually I learned a lot of people's names, but I didn't know everybody there. And sometimes somebody who I didn't know would win. And so I'd go up and I'd ask somebody, who is that? They just donated some money, and then they would tell me their name, and then I would tell the announcer, and the announcer would say, Sally Stiffarm just donated $50 back to the powwow committee, and then everybody would clap. Well, some of the times, not all the times, about 10% of the times, I would ask them what this person was, and they would tell me the wrong name as a joke. So who were they teasing? Were they teasing me, or were they teasing the person that they gave them the wrong name to? One time, this lady won, and she donated money back, and I asked this lady, who was that? And she told me her divorce name, not her name now, I know. And it turned out to be the cousin of the guy that she divorced. And she was picking on me. You know, and they started yelling back and forth. It was a lot of fun. So I got involved in all that stuff. That's not right, is it? They should have told me the right name, right? Like 90% of the times they told me the right name, but some of the times they didn't tell me the right name. Why am I talking about this? This is one of the saddest portions of my life.
It's kind of like what my brothers do to their non-native coworkers.
Pick on them,
Yeah.
give them the wrong information, and there are a lot of people that do that. Up north, they have the Dakota have people that they refer to as clowns, and the clowns are the individuals that are the policemen of the tribe. This is before white guys got there. They actually gave them badges and everything. The clowns were the policemen. So the clowns will go into, what they would do, they'd go into people's teepees, and if this person was committing adultery, they'd throw all their clothes out, and they say, you're not married to this lady anymore. You should be, since you're having sex with this lady, you should be married to this lady. You know, the clowns would do these kinds of things. They would create all this chaos, and then of course there was social embarrassment and whatnot. And that's the way they controlled people, by embarrassing them. And nobody knew who the clowns were, and they had special powers and whatnot. It was really kind of interesting. Well, sometimes I would come in contact with these guys, and they would always tell you the opposite of what it was. They were contraires, so they would give you bad information on purpose. So, and I had a friend that was a contraire, and half the information he told me was, I mean, he'd tell me, well, this means hello, you know, and it was like, was shit. It was the word for shit, you know, it was that kind of thing. That's not right. And so I felt like an idiot. Which was the point. I'm supposed to feel like an idiot since I have little knowledge. The International Association of Cross-Cultural Psychology is an organization of researchers studying culture and psychology from all around the world, and its members routinely find members from other countries to collaborate with on cross-cultural projects. So if you decide to go over to the Ukraine or whatever, you decide to go to another place, they will hook you up with a collaborator, somebody that wants to do similar research to what you want to do. And of course, then you write a paper together and everybody's happy. Oh, here's the nudity. Sorry. How many naked women are there in that picture? How many naked women are in that picture?
3.
Yeah, there's 3. Okay. This is really kind of interesting because these people don't ever wear anything on top. So, but she's supposed to, and evidently, and they probably never grab anybody's chest anyway. This is really kind of odd. Another effective strategy is to immerse oneself in another culture to learn it firsthand. This is an excellent way to gain a rich understanding of another culture, but it can be time-consuming and costly. There is no substitute for first-hand experience, and of course you have to live there. I have a friend who is a sociologist. He visits a select reservation every summer for about 2 weeks, and he's been doing this for about 4 years. So then he wrote a book about this culture. He spent 2 weeks over 4 summers. Wait a minute. He spent 8 weeks in total. Over 4 summers, how much does he know about that culture? Well, he lived with somebody for 2 weeks. Did he immerse himself in that culture? How much knowledge does he actually have? He's a sociologist, so he's got this ability to like accumulate knowledge just by touching, just by being in an area. So it was an Indian reservation, and he was trying to tell me about Indian reservations. And he was telling me I was completely wrong about all this stuff, since I'd only been there for 10 years. I'd only lived on a reservation for 10 years. Obviously, he had more knowledge than the 8 weeks that he spent on this reservation over a 4-year period for 2 weeks every summer. They only spent summers on the... I know. Okay, so is this picture inappropriate? That's the question. That's a question that I wanted to ask. Is it inappropriate?
No.
Or is it? No, it's not inappropriate. Is it okay? We got this white chick showing off her chest. She's naked. That's not right. People aren't supposed to be naked. Are they? Women aren't supposed to show their body parts like that, are they? Is it okay for these people, these 2 ladies, to not to show their body parts off? Well, they're not really showing their body parts off. That's the way they normally are. So is it inappropriate for the white chick to be bare-chested? Maybe she works at a topless bar. I don't know. Would that be appropriate? This is a really interesting picture. I mean, it's really a fascinating picture because do we even notice that these 2 ladies don't have, they're not working at a topless bar, it's just the way they are. But the lady in the middle, and the other thing is that they're touching her breasts. Is that appropriate?
It's the way of shaking hands.
It's a way of shaking hands. Here, let me take my shirt off so you can shake hands with me. It's a little weird. I know, it seems weird, doesn't it? It seems really odd. What if she grabbed a hold of their breasts? Would that be appropriate?
It's a personality test.
Yeah, no, this is weird. I don't know. When I found this picture, I went, I got to put this in the lecture. I'll probably get fired since it's pornography. Obviously, it's pornography. We all know what happened next. No, we don't. We have no idea.
Yeah, they went fishing.
Something.
That she was too skinny.
What were we talking about earlier? Oh, about Lake Powell and the French going to Lake Powell and not wearing any clothes at Lake Powell. Anyway. Is that appropriate? Maybe not. What time is it? 1997, Patricia Greenfield, and this is Patricia Greenfield, was doing field research about making textiles in Mexico. She gave the Zinacantecos women the same survey about their textile making that she gave, that she had used all over the world. It's exactly the same one. It had been vetted by her institution. It was a good instrument. She'd used it all over the world, but she got into trouble. She got into trouble with the Zinacantecos women. They got angry. And this is the reason they got angry. The Zinacantecos women approached the survey as if they were having a conversation. When Greenfield asked similar questions, she asked the same thing over and over and over again. This is normally how you do a survey to find out how people actually feel about things. They thought that she was stupid or making fun of them, and it made them angry. So she had to change the survey for the Zinacantecos women. And these are actually Zinacantecos women. I have a blouse, it's not for me, it's for my wife, of course, but I have a blouse that these ladies make, the Zinacantecos. It's heavy. It weighs like 3 pounds. It's really a heavy thing because it's all embroidery. It's just amazingly heavy. Anyway, so they got angry because they thought that she was making fun of them with her questions because she kept asking the same or similar questions over and over again. And they were upset. So sometimes you can make a mistake even though you're doing things the right way, as confusing as that is. Having your methods perceived in identical ways across different cultures is termed methodological equivalence. So if I ask you a question, would you take it the same way as if I asked it in Iowa? Would you see it exactly the same way? Well, probably you would because everybody's speaking exactly the same language. But what if it was 2 different languages? Can I ask a question? Do I know exactly what I'm saying if I'm speaking another language? Even if I speak that language fluently, is it possible that what I'm saying will be taken incorrectly? Is that a possibility? Sometimes researchers have to adapt their procedures so that it is understandable in each culture equally, and this can be a problem. So if you have a survey, you have to get it translated. And if it's translated, then you have to have it retranslated to make sure that that's what it actually says. Not only that, but sometimes saying one thing in one language isn't exactly the same thing in another language. So they may misinterpret what you're saying. The vast majority of cross-cultural research has been conducted between industrialized societies. The most common comparisons are between North Americans and East Asians. A lot of research about East Asians and North Americans, especially Canadians and people in the United States. Not especially people in Mexico. It's part of North America too, but there's not a lot of research of East Asians in Mexico. So we're trying to figure out what's going on. We have universities in China and in Japan, and we have universities in Canada and the United States, and they're trying to do research trying to figure out if both sides think exactly the same way. Both groups of individuals think the same way. Studying college students from different cultures also lends itself to making meaningful comparisons, as students the world over tend to be familiar with many of the kinds of procedures used in psychological studies. And college students tend to be an accessible sample for most university researchers. So if I were to do research on this reservation, I would probably use my students. And that's just the way it is. It's easier, it's cheaper, I don't have to travel, I don't have to go to Tuba City to do my research. I can do it right here. You guys are coming to me. I don't have to worry about it. I can pretend that you guys are an average group of individuals off the reservation. I can do that. And so a lot of the research deals with students. It doesn't deal with people in Chicago. It doesn't deal with people in Detroit. It doesn't deal with people in Albuquerque. It deals with students who are living in Albuquerque, students living in Chicago, students living in Detroit. When researchers overemphasize college students, there tends to be a significant problem with generalizability. So you guys aren't the same as your parents. You're not the same as your brothers and sisters. Maybe you've got younger brothers and sisters and they play video games all day. Well, you can't play video games because you've got to do your work, right? I mean, you've got to do your college work. So you're not exactly the same. Not only that, but you graduated from high school with a whole classroom full of people. Were you the average person in that classroom? Can I take you and assume that if you went to Ganado High School, that everybody at Ganado High School has the same ideas that you have? Can I do that? Probably not. I'm guessing if you're here and you're in college, most of the people at Ganado High School didn't go to college afterwards. So you're probably above average. You may be way above average. So you don't represent those guys at all. There may be some people in your class that were pot smokers. As horrible as that sounds. So you don't have anything to do with those guys. So you're not an average. That's just the way it is. So we can't really generalize it to everybody. We have to talk about who we did the research with. The research can't be generalized with any other population other than college students, and it's very logical. Overusing students affects power. Power reflects the quality of the design of the study and determines if the design is sensitive enough to identify the anticipated effects. Sometimes the hypothesis is correct, but the design doesn't have the power to be able to provide support for it. And of course, this has to do with Dr. Wolf, and this has to do with Dr. Kine, has to do with Dr. Ami. They talk about power. How much power does your research have? And of course, this is something very real. If you don't have any power in your research, then your research means very little. It can mean absolutely nothing. Why don't we stop right here and we'll pick this up next time with overusing students. Yeah, students from all over the world.